This week, our study brings us to Jonah chapter 2. We begin our reading by repeating the closing verse of chapter 1, verse 17. The Hebrew text actually has chapter 1, verse 17 as the first verse of its chapter 2. So, without further ado, let's find out what happens to Jonah.
And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying,
I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord.
And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land.
I thought it would be pretty cool to end with that special effect. Reading the Hebrew text as it's written actually in the original allows us to see Jonah's time inside the fish as the defining context of chapter 2. In verse 17 of our chapter 1, again, verse 1 of chapter 2 in the Hebrew original, Jonah is swallowed by the fish, and in chapter 2, verse 10, he is expelled by the fish. In between, the fish takes Jonah from the sea to the dry ground. The two terms Jonah used back in chapter 1, both echoing the original creation story, to identify Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, as that creator. This inclusion emphasizes once again the sovereignty of the creator God over Jonah's entire situation. The first issue presented to us in chapter 2, then, is the exact role of the fish in the overall narrative. And to begin with, it's a fish, not a whale. Whale, which is the term we commonly think of, is kind of like the apple in the story of the fall that isn't there either. It's the result here of a misreading of the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint. The Hebrew uses only the generic word that could be used of any fish. It's just a fish. Simplistic interpreters read being swallowed by the fish as God's punishment of Jonah for disobeying him. And in one sense, they're right. Had Jonah, after all, not been fleeing from the Lord, he would never have been in the position of being in the ocean to be swallowed by the fish. And certainly, being inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights with no expectation, humanly speaking at least, of ever being liberated, cannot have been a pleasant experience for Jonah. But viewed in the overall context of the story, being swallowed by the fish must be seen not as God's punishment of Jonah, but as his rescue of Jonah from the otherwise watery grave that Jonah must have expected and knew he deserved. That's essentially what you can read into chapter 1, verse 12, when he tells the sailors, throw me overboard. I know it's my fault. Then the storm will calm down for you. And certainly Jonah must have had something like this awareness that God had actually rescued him in order to pray in the way that the balance of chapter 2 describes. So as we move forward in our English translation, verse 1 describes Jonah praying. The prayer is uttered from the belly of the fish, indicating that this was a prayer in real time, not one that Jonah composed afterward, recollecting his experience. The Hebrew text also uses the word pray to describe Jonah's activity. This is significant because in other places where pagans are described as praying, a different word, which we translate as cry out or call out, is used. That's the case both with the sailors in chapter 1 and the Ninevites in chapter 3. The word pray, as opposed to call out, is indicative of the difference. Jonah is a Hebrew. He's in covenant relationship with Yahweh, Israel's God. The pagans are not, or at least in the case of the sailors, not until after they offer sacrifice to Yahweh. Verses 2 through 9 of chapter 2 are, properly speaking, a psalm. In the Hebrew text, they're printed in the parallel form indicative of Hebrew poetry, in which the second line of each couplet repeats the theme of the first line, using different words, sometimes expanding on or elaborating the theme of the first line. As you read verses 2 through 9, you can catch overtones of many of the selections in the Psalter. This is not surprising. There's almost no psalm of the 150 that doesn't echo phrases from numerous of the others. As a religious Hebrew, Jonah would have been familiar with many of the psalms that we know today, and his piety would naturally have been given voice in similar language. From the outset, Jonah prays with a confidence that seemingly belies his, to say the least, difficult situation. Even in verse 2, Jonah indicates that the Lord has already heard and responded to his plea for help. And this is so, even though he's equally quick to acknowledge God's sovereign superintendence over what has happened to him. It's the Lord, Jonah says in verse 3, not the sailors who cast him into the deep. In verses 4 through the first half of 6, we get a picture of how bad Jonah's situation really was. His first thought was that he would no longer be able to worship the God from whose presence in the temple he had fled in chapter 1. Perhaps the shock of hitting the water afforded Jonah a reality check that he had been unwilling to receive up to that point, that the action of his rebellion against Yahweh's command had real and disastrous consequences. Jonah's second thought in verse 5 was even more primal. This was the end for him. He was dying. In Hebrew thought, Sheol was the place of the dead. It was barred in so that those who went there would be incapable of escape. Together, verse 2, where Jonah indicates that he prayed out of the belly of Sheol, and verse 6, where he says that its bars closed in on him forever, raise the intriguing question, not only of whether Jonah's time in the fish was a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Jesus. You can see Jesus' perspective on that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. But whether Jonah had actually died and was resuscitated by God once he was inside the fish. Regardless of what exactly the first half of verse 6 describes, it represents a turning point for Jonah. Throughout the book thus far, his trajectory has been down. First, he goes down to Joppa, then down into a ship, then down into the hold, then down into the sea, then more down into the fish. But now, in the second half of verse 6, Jonah describes subsequent action of God in his behalf, and he does so with gratitude. God, Jonah says, echoing many similar places in the Psalms, has brought up Jonah's life from the pit. In the same holy temple to which Jonah feared he would never return, that was verse 4, now in verse 7, God receives Jonah's prayer. Consequently, Jonah expresses confidence in Yahweh's identity. Pagans worship worthless idols. But, like the sailors at the end of chapter 1, Jonah says he will sacrifice to the Lord. Again, like the sailors, he will make vows and he will pay. As a down payment on his promise, in verse 9, Jonah articulates the great truth anticipating the gospel of Jesus. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Jonah has grasped the incredible, unending, rich grace of God. How well he's grasped it, we'll see in the remainder of the book. In any event, it's as if Jonah's words at the end of verse 9 push a button in the fish. Instantly, God commands the fish, and it vomits Jonah out onto dry land, setting the stage for the second half of the book, which we'll encounter when we turn to chapter 3.